So Myles Wickstead, you have very large trajectory and experience in development cooperation and as a British diplomat. And after all that experience, all those years, today you depicted the United Kingdom as a development superpower. So what is a development superpower?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think it has to do with being a superpower across the international spectrum. I don't think you can be just an aid superpower. I think you have to have influence in diplomacy, in international organisations within the UN, within the World Bank, and defence as well, actually. I think you have to see international issues as being linked to one another in a way. I think over the last 20 years or so, the UK has lived up to its commitments on development quantity. It's reached the 0.7% target, but also it's been a leader in quality as well. And I think the period, particularly between 1997 and 2015, it exhibited real global leadership and others followed. I think now the UK is in an interesting position. We are possibly about to leave the European Union, a lot to be played out over the next months. And I think what's interesting is that the UK has been actually a superpower within the European Union. It's been a force for good. I think it's been very helpful in the way it's influenced policy. And I think if we leave the European Union, I think both the UK and the European Union will be poorer for that.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because actually the UK has been very influential on European development cooperation, but it hasn't happened the other way around necessarily, in the sense that a claim of other European Union member states is that EU institutions and other member states had a hard time trying to convince the United Kingdom to join, for instance, joint programming in development in European development programs and so on. So, do you think it has been actually an outlier in some sense in some facets of development? That's one question, and the other is if the UK leaves the European Union, would it stop being development superpower as it was very influential inside the European institutions? Or can it be development superpower and a non-European member development superpower through other bilateral relations and through other multilateral organizations such as the World Bank, for instance?
So I think in answer to your first question, because the UK had a very significant programme of its own and was a member of other organisations like leading the Commonwealth, for example, the UK wished to preserve a certain independence on what it did, so that perhaps made it a little bit more reluctant than some other countries to join in joint programming, etc. Mm-hmm. I must say from my own experience, both running a development office overseas and being an ambassador overseas, the European network was a very important one for me, both in terms of just talking about policies, getting coherence across the board. So, and I think on your second question, I think it'll be more difficult for the UK to be a superpower in any sense once we leave the European Union, if that is what happens. A few years ago, the UK did some reviews of its multilateral and bilateral aid, and what it found actually in the multilateral aid review was that the funds put through the European budget were pretty effective, and the funds put through the European Development Fund were very effective. So here we are leaving two organisations that actually disperse British taxpayers' money in a very effective way. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of a tension in there, let's say, no more than that.
Okay, so thank you very much, Myles, for being with us today.
It's a great pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.